Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. This is Tanya Burwell from the Women's Programs Office, and on the line as your presenters, we have Dr. Alette Caldwell-Temple, who's the chair of the Committee on Women in Psychology, and we have your presenter, Dr. Ruth Fassinger. In a minute, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Caldwell-Temple, but I just wanted to go over this first screen, which would be a few helpful tips for today's webinar. So just to let you know that the webinar is being recorded and we will post it at a later date. So in order to reduce background noise, we're asking that you mute your phone and or computer and take your phone off of speaker mode if you do have it on speaker mode, because it'll avoid any feedback. We're also going to use the question tab that you may see in your panel when you signed in to go to webinar for questions, and the questions will be addressed at the end of the webinar. And just for final note is that after the webinar is complete, you will receive a questionnaire via email with just some questions for follow-up about the webinar. And on that note, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Caldwell-Temple.
Thank you, Tanya, and thank you to everybody for attending today. Tanya, if you can advance to the next slide, I want to begin by introducing everyone who was behind this amazing report. First of all, Dr. Ruth Fassinger was the principal investigator for this report, and she was guided both by her advisory committee and many members of the committee are women in psychology. And as you will see throughout the presentation today, we relied heavily on data collection from the Center for Workforce Studies, and of course, we couldn't do any of this without Sherry, Tanya, and Ashley from the Women's Program Office. So, what we're going to do today is this is the initial webinar to introduce the major findings from the updated report, and we're going to review a sampling of the recommendations for future action steps to be taken both by psychology in general and then specifically for APA. And our goal is also to answer participant questions and invite your involvement in implementing the report recommendations. And finally, we're really interested in identifying what you want for future webinars and other activities related to support. So with that, it is my distinct to turn the webinar over to Dr. Ruth Bassinger.
Okay, thank you very much. Welcome everybody, glad you're with us. I just want to commend Dr. Alette Coble-Temple and the Committee on Women in Psychology for making this happen. They were responsible for making sure that the report gets posted and disseminated, and this is the first in a series of things that they've got planned, and they're just powerhouses of energy and intelligence in getting this out there. So thank you to CWP, and thank you to the Women's Programs Office, as always, for your continued support and work around these issues. So what this current report is that we're talking about is an update and expansion of a report that was done in 1995 by a task force on the changing gender composition of psychology. And it was a CWP, this is a CWP initiative. It was funded by the Science Directorate, and who also provided the committee, or the Center for Workforce Studies folks, to work with me closely on collecting the data for this report. The original 1995 report was done based on a response to concerns about what people were calling the feminization of the field back at that time. Large influxes of women into psychology had begun in the late 1970s and were continuing through the 80s and 90s. And there was concern about the status and prestige of the field being able to be maintained with an influx of women and so forth. That 1995 report, which was also a CWP initiative at the time, investigated sociocultural context, education and employment variables, and the status of women within APA as the Chief Psychology Professional Association. And CWP was responsible for the follow-up and monitoring of progress on the many recommendations that were made. And so this update of the report that's been done in the last couple of years was part of CWP's fulfilling of their responsibility for following up and monitoring. In this report that we produced, the same structure is used as in the original report. So we have again investigated sociocultural context, education variables, employment status, and the status of women within APA as a professional organization. The overall report is it's 6 chapters, about 170 pages. All the tables and charts are embedded in the report. This will be up shortly if it's not up already. I know there's an executive summary up for you to access. And there is so much information in this report. We can only give you a small sampling of it today, as Dr. Coble-Temple already indicated. In this report, one of the ways in which it was expanded as well as being updated is that particular attention was given to issues in academic and healthcare settings, because healthcare settings have really exploded in the past couple of decades, and also to underrepresented groups, because very little attention had been devoted to that in the previous report. Next slide. Before I start giving you data, rather than waiting to the end and then telling you all the caveats, I'd like to start with them and indicate the areas in which we have some lacks or limitations. Most of the data were provided and synthesized by the Center for Workforce Studies. I cannot say enough about how wonderful they are. In particular, Karen Stam and Peggy Christidas were very, very instrumental in this report. They have access not only to the very large amount of survey data that APA collects routinely, but they also have access to other agency data sources like NSF, the American Community Survey, which is the National Bureau of Labor Statistics, IPEDS data from the Department of Education, and so on. And they synthesize these data, and so they know these data inside out, and they're really wonderful at producing what we need. I myself, I'm an expert in women's career development and issues of diversity in the workforce. So I also used my own knowledge of the literature to gather data, compute some of the statistics and so forth that we needed, and synthesize the data. I want to mention that in this report and in the work that we did, CWP and myself, we conceptualized gender not as a binary characteristic, but as an institutionalized system of social practices, which is what gender really is. However, given the way data are mostly collected currently out there in the world and even within APA, the data are mostly descriptive of categorical gender differences. So, for example, looking at the difference between men and women on a given variable. We also accessed available data on underrepresented groups, and some of those groups are listed below there. And the data were tested for significant differences where possible. Not all the data allowed us to do that, but we did that as much as we possibly can. I want to mention, though, that the data, as you probably might expect, are limited on most of these underrepresented groups that I've listed there, and intersectional data where you're looking at both gender and another marginalized status like race or ethnicity or sexual orientation are almost non-existent. So there's lots of opportunity there for some future work to be done. So let's start with our overview of the findings. I'll start with the punchline first. This is the main thing we found. It probably won't surprise you. Gender disparities persist, and in some cases they're exacerbated for women with other marginalized statuses in the workplace. And they're represented in educational patterns, employment patterns, and professional attainment and leadership patterns, and I'm going to be showing you data in all of these areas. And again, I want to emphasize this is just a sampling, much larger pieces of data. Next slide. So, gender disparities persist, exclamation point. Despite the predominance of women in the psychology workforce, there are about 2/3 of the psychology workforce at this point in time, which is about 180,000 psychologists. They continue to experience a lack of parity with men in many critical areas, and some of these areas show little or no progress in the past 2 decades. So the prospects for future change are somewhat mixed. We're going to start with disparities in education, and this first table shows degree attainment for women, and you can see the percentage of doctoral degrees awarded to women in psychology, which is in about the middle of the table there, relative to other fields. And you can see that psychology, like other fields, and these are fields to which psychology is often compared in these various databases. You can see that psychology, like these other fields, is exhibiting the increases in numbers of women. And if you look at the percentage of degree recipients in 2011, you can see that the overall 2/3 percentage of working psychologists is a wee bit lower than the number of degree recipients. You can see that the number of degree recipients is greater, and so we can expect to see these increases in percentages of women in psychology increase over time because of these increases in degree awards. Next slide. This next slide shows the doctorates broken down by gender and race, ethnicity. So you can see the racial ethnic groups listed there at the bottom of the table, and the numbers going up the side, men blue and women in red. As you can see in this particular table, the numbers of racial ethnic minority psychologists are still very small, much smaller than we would like, and that most of the growth in psychology is in fact among women, including women of color. You can see that the numbers of women of color are much higher than the numbers of men of color. Next slide. There's a lot we can talk about related to education, and if we have time, we'll get back to some of these things, but we decided to highlight an issue that has gotten a lot of attention in the media and certainly is gets a lot of attention within psychology, and a lot of concern and a lot of work devoted to this issue, which is educational debt, the amount of debt that students incur as they are gaining their education and training. It's a big problem, particularly at the level of doctoral education across the workplace more generally, and we see it manifested in psychology as well. So we tried to figure out what the variables are that might contribute to that, and this table shows those data. As you can see on this table, the biggest contributor to the high levels of student debt in the doctoral arena is contained in the difference between students enrolled in PsyD programs and PhD programs, with PsyD program students incurring much higher levels of debt. This is probably due to the fact that many PhD programs are located in large public universities. Many PsyD programs are located in freestanding professional schools with higher costs associated with getting a degree. What's a little bit alarming about that is, excuse me, that is in the context of what are generally considered to be shorter programs. PsyD programs are supposed to be somewhat shorter programs than PhD programs, and yet we still see those high levels of debt. So that is something to be concerned about. You can also see from this table that being female, being older, and being a member of a racial ethnic minority group also increases debt levels. And the problem with all of this, when you put it together, is that PsyD programs, in fact, are the programs that have in them the largest numbers of female, older, and racial ethnic minority students. So that, combined with the location of the program as a PsyD program, creates an issue. There is also some evidence that PsyD grads may experience some difficulty later on with the National Psychology Licensing Exam, which may in fact also increase the debt levels that we see in our other data. So that also is something to pay attention to. Now, next slide. We could think to ourselves, well, maybe a lot of this disappears when people finally get employed, and some of these gaps are made up for in salaries once people are earning money. This table shows the median salary of recent degree recipients. So this is early career salaries we're looking at here. So as we think about employment, we start to run into the large wage gaps that are well documented in the workforce and that in fact are present in psychology as well. And so you can see on this table the gender breakdown, and you can see on the other, the right side of the table, the numbers for white workers versus the various racial ethnic groups that are also represented in the table. And of course you can see in the table that men's salaries are significantly higher than women's in most of these fields. And you can also see, and this is, you can also, of course, see that white salaries tend to be higher than the salaries of racial ethnic minorities. What is a little bit, I think, depressing about this slide is you can also see that psychology is relatively low compared to all of those other fields, even including the social sciences. The social sciences get jacked up some by the fact that economics is a field that's included in their purview, and those salaries tend to be higher. But I think this is sobering information. The other thing that I want to note is that salaries are what is officially reported in most of these various surveys and databases. These do not necessarily include other income that people make as part of their jobs. So, for example, people might have grant money that pays them in the summer. They might be doing consulting. They might be doing additional practice on the side if they're teaching. Or if they're not teaching but doing practice, they might be doing teaching and supervision on the side. So there are lots of ways to make money, and one of the things we know from the literature is that men tend to be able to take advantage of those additional sources of income in greater numbers than women. So these salary discrepancies only tell a small part of the story, and the discrepancies are actually greater than they appear from a simple table like this. Next slide. So now let's look at what happens, and we're going to look here in the next couple slides at academic settings as a particular example of what happens in employment related to advancement. And this slide shows, these are departments, graduate departments of psychology, so this is psychology, across 3 time periods starting in the mid-1990s when the last report came out to more current time, and you can see the percentages of full professors on down to other ranks not specified. And what this shows, I think pretty clearly, is that men predominate at the upper ranks of the academic professoriate. The growth in the percentages of women is largely unchanged over time. There was some increase in assistant professor hires a couple of decades ago. It's largely leveled off, and if you look at more even data in the last year or two, you see that leveling off sort of remains consistent. One place we do see increases for women and men as well, but not quite as dramatically as women, is in the ranks of other. And this tends to be people who are contingent faculty. Contingent faculty are those whose positions and salaries are contingent on the availability of funding, which means these are the adjunct faculty, the clinical faculty, the research faculty, the ones who are not in tenure track, more reliable, solid positions. And this is a problem nationwide right now in higher education, and it is a problem that disproportionately affects women, including women in psychology, as this table shows. Next slide. This slide shows one possible aspect of the gap between the ranks for men and women in academic positions. This is the number of years between receiving the doctorate and getting promoted to associate professor, which is usually also the gaining of tenure in most academic departments at the current time, at least those that haven't done away with tenure altogether yet. And you can see that on average it takes women about a year longer to achieve tenure and promotion to associate professor relative to men. We also know from data in other fields, we don't, as far as I know, we don't have these data in psychology yet, but we should. There have been studies, for example, of computer science, sociology, and English. One recent study of these fields showed, for example, that women or men were significantly more likely to be granted tenure than women, even when productivity was held constant. So that old sort of adage, or that belief that somehow women have to be better than men just to be on the playing field, or women have to be more productive than men just to be treated equitably seems to have some support behind it. And just to dispel the idea that this is all due to academic inertia and that if women are just given enough time, more time, they will catch up to men. There have been studies of this phenomenon of academic inertia, which those of you who are in academic institutions probably know well. And these studies have shown the effects of systemic sexism in academic settings, in addition to the effects of academic inertia. So it's not just that women need to catch up. And if you remember what you saw on the last slide, those kind of changes are very, very slow to happen. Next slide. So what happens in academia when women and men seek leadership positions in academia? This is one slide of the gender of department chairs. Again, this is U.S. graduate departments of psychology. So this is your colleagues. And you can see that, that there's been a gradual converging of percentages of men and women as department chairs over the last roughly 10 or 12 years. However, you also see a leveling off that's occurred more recently, and indeed this leveling off tends to continue as you look at the last couple of years worth of data. So we're kind of in a holding pattern here, again belying that idea that somehow there's a catch-up process that is happening here that will bring these into total convergence. Okay, next slide. One of the things that we think about and talk about a lot is the issue of full-time versus part-time employment, and there's been a lot written in this in the women's career development literature about some of the factors associated with part-time versus full-time employment and the extent to which part-time employment is a choice. And if you could see me, you could see that I'd be doing air quotes around the word choice because it's very difficult to talk about choice when there are lots of constraints related to socialization, the structure of workplaces, the structure of families, salary discrepancies between women and men, and so forth and so on, all of the things that have women in families making decisions about their employment. So we have to be cautious when we think about that. But this shows the patterns in the health provider workforce. Health service provider positions, as I noted before, are an area of enormous growth in psychology. This, by the way, includes those in independent practice. And this is also one of the few places where we have a little bit of intersectional data. So we have gender and race and ethnicity here put together in producing these statistics. You can see from this table, or this graph, that significantly fewer women, including racial ethnic minority women, than men are employed full-time. More white women are working part-time than any other group. And we know from other data that it is primarily women more than men, about 78% in the health service provider workplace, who are in direct service positions versus about 69% of men. So what we are looking at here is large percentages of women, particularly white women, employed part-time in direct service positions. So keep that in mind as we talk about some other issues as we go along. So now we're going to move to, next slide, professional attainment disparities. This is where we start looking at what happens in APA as the leading professional organization in psychology. And I'll show you data on all these areas. By 2013, women represented more than half of APA membership. There are 11 divisions that currently that have at least 55% female representation, and these tend to be the divisions that many people associate with the presence of women: school, psych, health, psych, couple of developmental divisions, 3 child-related divisions, trauma, etc. Women currently hold a little more than half of APA governance positions, and I'll show you that in a moment. But women continue to be underrepresented in positions of formal influence and authority. They may be involved in lower level participation as members and contributors, not necessarily in the positions of leadership in some of those places. And women continue to be underrepresented in recognition, awards, and honors. So let me show you some more detailed data here. Next slide. Here is the proportion of women by type of APA governance service and year. Those of you involved in APA governance know these categories. And you can see, as I noted, that a little more than half are composed of women. What I think is interesting on this slide is that council, which is the primary decision-making component of APA governance, membership governance, tends to have the lower numbers of women than the boards, committees, and other areas of governance. And that, again, supports the notion that women may not always be in the positions of power and influence as much as we would expect, given their numbers in psychology. Next slide. The next slide has to do with scholarly leadership. APA is a scientific organization as well as a practice organization, and it gains much of its voice in the world through its scholarly base. And so the representation of women as scholarly leaders in the field is enormously important. We know that about 1/3 of psychologists are involved in the scientific review process of APA journals are women. About 46% of them in 2013 were ad hoc reviewers, so not necessarily all of them even formally on editorial boards, but definitely doing some of the work of reviewing the science in psychology, but only 18% are journal editors. And from to the next point, between 1995 and 2013, we had percentages of women editors that ranged from 14 to 35%. It leveled out at about 18%, and it has stayed that way over time. Could you go back to the last slide again? Thanks. When we talk about APA awards and honors, and Claire Etaw and her colleagues have done some great research in this if you want to follow up on this. We know that APA representation of women lags behind men in awards and honors. Of 7 long-standing prestigious APA awards, men are honored significantly more often than women in 6 of those awards, and women are ahead in 1 but only marginally. And even in recent years, women have not earned more than 38% of the awards. They've achieved parity in only 1, which is contributions to independent practice. And they've been recognized less than 15% in the 2 most prestigious scientific awards, which are the Distinguished Scientific Contributions and Distinguished Scientific Applications of Psychology. So again, they're not necessarily being recognized. In 2013, 10 of 27 APA awards were given to women. 3 women shared the honor with other women or with men. Okay, now we can go to the next slide. The last thing we're going to talk about in terms of professional attainment is APA fellow status. And so I want you to see these 2 graphs. I'll tell you the punchline already. They're not getting fellow status at the same rates as men. So this shows you, fix this little graph here in your mind. This shows you the total APA membership by gender, the way that it has increased from 1995 to 2013, about 200% for women. It's gone down for men about 11% during that time. Not a huge drop in overall numbers, but slightly. Now, then let's go to the next one. Here's the graph of the representation by gender of APA fellows over that same period of time. Again, you can see some convergence occurring, but women are still far less likely than men to be fellows. And again, this is important because this is APA's designated marker of achievement in the profession. And I think the other thing that's important about it is that fellow status is essentially decided and put forth to APA for formal vote from the division level. So it's difficult to argue that somehow there's some standard being used that's not sensitive to the needs of certain divisions or the scholarly standards of certain divisions, because it's divisions who are deciding these things and putting them forth to APA. So this is clearly a level on which we need to work. Okay, so this brings us to the next slide, which is talking about why some of these disparities might still persist. And because we're running out of time, I'm not going to be able to talk about a lot of these things in great detail, but these are some of the barriers to women's career development in general that have been discussed in the literature widely. They've been documented in women's career development overall, particularly women in male-dominated fields and particularly women in STEM fields. And psychology is a STEM field, although psychology is not always teased out in the studies of STEM disciplines. So I think it's reasonable to believe that these are the kinds of variables that could be fruitfully investigated in order to understand why some of these patterns exist that we are seeing out there in the literature and in our own data on psychologists. But we clearly need a lot more data to determine what is happening here. The one thing that I do want to mention, well, two things I'd like to mention on this slide that I think are important. One is the issue of shadow jobs. Very often women, racial ethnic minorities, people with other marginalized statuses may be one of the only or the only person with that particular status characteristic in their workplace, and therefore they are expected implicitly to take on lots of other jobs, like listening to sobbing students who are being treated badly by others, starting support groups for students who also have marginalized statuses, secretly helping students with their papers or dissertations, all kinds of things that we end up doing for which we do not get recognition or any kind of pay or reward. These are called shadow jobs. They're jobs that you're expected to do. It's frowned upon if you don't do them, and yet you don't really get any reward for doing them. The other thing that I want to mention here is the well-known motherhood penalty for women and marriage bonus for men. The whole idea, and this is borne out in much research, that women who are married and mothers are judged as less committed to careers, less committed to their jobs in the workplace, whereas men who are married and fathers are committed, are viewed as more stable and more committed because they have families to provide for. And this is one of those areas where even family variables are viewed very, very differently for women and men. Let's go to the next slide, and we'll come back to this if we have time. So let's talk about taking action. What is CWP going to try to do next? We would note that reports without action are meaningless. CWP's core values are all about achieving the empowerment of all underrepresented groups, not just women. It's in the best interest of psychology as a field to foster and maintain a diverse spectrum of perspectives and expertise. This has been borne out in the research on workplace diversity over and over and over, and it is true of psychology as well. And the immediate action that APA could take to remedy this underrepresentation issue strengthens the integrity of the association and the field. And this brings me to the next point, next slide, which is APA's role in this. APA really, because it's the leading professional society in psychology, with all of the attendant expertise in behavioral change that we bring to bear on these issues, puts it in a position where it should be serving both as a model and as a leader in addressing these inequities in the larger workforce. It's made some great efforts within its own organization, and it's time to not only strengthen the internal efforts, but to strengthen them to the point where psychology is a model for other fields, and APA is thus leading the way in the larger society. Next slide. And here are some specific recommendations that come from CWP and from the work that we did on this study. The first has to do with our scientific knowledge base. The Center for Workforce Studies and other relevant APA groups should identify the data that we need to address the recommendations in the report and collect, analyze, and report these data. And there are just some examples there of data that are needed that grow out of some of the lacks that I've pointed out throughout this presentation of some of the things we don't know about women psychologists in the workforce and ways we might try to tease out some of the factors that contribute to the air quote choices that they make about their careers and the paths and patterns that they end up taking. APA and APF should organize funded research on the career experiences of women psychologists, and APA should support convention programming on topics that are related to the content and recommendations of this report. Those are all related to building knowledge. The next slide is specifically addresses wage inequity because it is probably the single biggest or one of the single biggest problems for women in the workplace. If wage equity were really present, there are a lot of other problems that wouldn't be as stark for women as they are. And so the advocacy for gender-related wage equity in psychology has to be a top priority. And there are some specific examples here using the American Psychologist as a prestigious venue for disseminating information, advocating for policies that promote wage transparency. We know from all of the data on the wage gap, the gender-based wage gap in society, that wherever wage allocation processes are open and transparent and obviated to everyone, wage gaps decrease and in some cases even disappear. Because a lot of the backdoor deals and a lot of the bias that enters into the process can't happen when people are watching. So transparency is hugely important. Incorporating gender equity publicly and clearly into existing APA initiatives means highlighting these issues into things like the Healthy Workplace Initiative and other things APA is already doing, and of course monitoring progress with data. The next slide has to do specifically with the academy and what we do about academic issues. One idea is to create a multi-institutional task force led by APA to address some of these gender inequities in academic settings, and again, looking at psychology first and using that as a model to solve these problems in other areas could be very, very helpful. And these foci that are listed here are the ones that we've identified in the report as the big barriers to women's careers in the academy. The next, last slide about recommendations has to do with professional leadership and moving women into positions of leadership. The first is about promoting research on effective leadership development strategies and implementing programs. And the programs would build on leadership skills and self-efficacy for leaders for women who think they might want to be leaders or who could be leaders, facilitating mentoring and support for women in leadership positions already, and increasing the numbers and effectiveness of women in leadership in various settings and roles. And I think the APA Leadership Institute for Women in Psychology is an absolutely beautiful example of a group that is doing this and doing it, I think, very well. Another idea is expanding on APA conventioning programming to help women find pathways into scientific leadership roles like journal editorship, obtaining external funding, and so on. Being proactive in addressing gender and race disparities in journal editor and other kinds of positions, and considering new models of participation. For example, co-editing or co-leading various kinds of groups may be a way for women who have limited time and resources to participate in leadership roles without needing to commit to them solely and with complete full responsibility. And it's worth looking at some of those possibilities. And of course, just as with wages, making awards and recognition selection processes transparent. As soon as everybody knows exactly what is happening and how it is happening, it is much more difficult to be led astray into pathways that might lead us into bias. So again, last slide. We're now moving on to an area for questions and discussion. I know I went fast because I wanted to leave time for any questions you might have, and if there are any of these points you want to come back to. The reference for the report is listed there, and the next slide has the contact information for both the Women's Programs Office, for Alette Coble-Temple as the chair of CWP, and for myself as the principal investigator in this report. So what questions do you have? What questions can I or Alette or Sherry Miles Cohen answer for you?
Well, first, I just want to say thank you, Ruth, for really highlighting the key facts that you put into this report. I know it was a lot of data to cover in a short time, and you and I really had to make difficult decisions on what to put in and what to cut out. So I appreciate your ability to get so much in.
Thank you.
I just wanted to provide everybody in the Go to webinar control panel, you will see a tab labeled questions. If you click on that, it should open a window that allows you to type your questions. I don't see any questions so far. Tanya, do we have any questions?
I don't see any questions showing up in the box yet as well on my end. So please, as Alette mentioned, there should be a question tab on your screen, and there's a box. If you enter your question, the presenters can see the text of your question and respond.
And if there's anything you just want us to talk about a little more, we can do that too.
Exactly. The one thing I want Tanya to highlight is that we will has the entire report available online, correct?
That's correct. And the report, the entire report should be up now, should be posted as a PDF, and the appendices have been submitted and they should be up shortly as well.
Awesome. So where can they find that link?
Okay, let me pull that up. Sorry, here.
In addition, we are working to develop fact sheets in the major areas of the report, and we will be working on drafting a formal journal article.
And if everyone looks at their chat feature, I've included the link to the entire report. I just shared my screen here, and I see there is a question.
Yay!
Yes, this is from Dr. Woodruff, and it says, if possible, speak more about the specialization fields by gender in psychology.
Ruth?
By specialization fields, do you mean like clinical, counseling, school, et cetera? Or are you talking about the specializations as captured by division membership?
Yes. That's Dr. Woodruff. I have a yes from you, but I think
okay, well, let me just say a couple things, and maybe this will answer your question.
Oh, Ruth, I'm sorry. She's just added clinical, etc.
Oh, okay. Well, good. You read my mind. That's exactly where I was going to go to, Dr. Woodruff. One of the things we know from the vast growth in the health service provider workplace opportunities is that is where a large part of the growth is in psychology, and that includes, of course, clinical psychology. And in fact, a lot of the increase in the clinical psychology or in the health service provider degree production is in clinical psychology. So you don't have this in front of you, but we have a pie chart in the report that is doctoral degrees by subfield in the year 2011-2012. And as I look at this pie chart, in general, and these are the total percentage of doctoral degrees awarded, okay? So this is in all of psychology. General psychology was 31%. Clinical psychology was 43% of the doctoral degrees. Counseling psychology was 7%. IO psychology was 2%. School psychology was 4%. And then programs that are combined clinical and counseling, or clinical counseling and applied, or clinical counseling school, there are a few programs like that made up 1%. And educational psychology was 8% of the total. And then there's some small percentage not accounted for. Developmental and child psychology were at 1%, experimental psychology at 2%, and social psychology at 1%. So if you put all that together, you can see that clinical psychology, the large numbers of clinical psychologists are driving doctoral degree production mostly, and it is primarily in health service provider fields, as you might expect for clinical psychology. I hope that was helpful. I can try to find something else if you would like me to. Hello?
We had another question, Tanya.
Yes.
Do you read that?
Yes, there's a question from Dr. Acevedo. The question says, is it possible that the women gap is mainly related with the empowerment and education, also with the social historical context? If so, how can we as psychology professionals can change this fact?
The answer to your first question is absolutely with a capital A. We know that all of these patterns that we see are embedded in sociocultural context, gender role socialization, racial socialization, sexual socialization. I mean, all of it is related to the ways we are taught to see ourselves and see others in society, and the habits that we develop based on that, and more importantly, the systems that we build that then emanate from all of those beliefs. And those beliefs are really, really difficult to change. But we also know we have a hefty number of people in psychology who study organizational change processes and who are experts in organizational change processes and can, in fact, help us figure out what the interventions are that we need to do in the organizations and in the sociocultural systems around us in which all of these things are embedded. We know programs that work in education around these areas. We have successfully, for example, as a field, we've successfully mounted interventions to decrease bullying in schools, and there's been success there. We have mounted programs aimed at decreasing overt bias discrimination in, for example, in hiring. We know it still exists, but it's decreased, and that's largely because of interventions that have been developed by people who understand how to change large systems. And I think that we need to use the expertise we have in our organization to do that. One of the things, I know we're running out of time here, but I just want to make one more plug here. The APA sponsors a National Multicultural Conference and Summit every other year in January, and it will be happening in 2019 again. We just had one this year, and it's a great place to learn lots about what some of the actual real applied efforts are that people are making in lots of areas of diversity. And one of the things I've noticed is that almost all of the conversations are about how to move organizations, how to move systems, how to move groups of people into areas of change. And I think given the current political climate that we're in, this is more important than ever. So I think that's a big place we need to start.
Excellent response and excellent question. I know that we're out of time. I want to again thank Dr. Passenger for leading us through this webinar. I really want to emphasize that all the participants fill out the survey at the end so that we can keep doing these and making them effective for all of you.
Yes. Thank you, Alette. And we'd like to thank everyone for your participation today. Again, I've shared the second screen that just shows the homepage for the report. And in the chat section, I've sent the link, but I will have access to the emails for everyone in attendance and can send the link to the full report once the call is finished. So we'd like to thank you. Thank you, Dr. Caldwell-Temple, and thank you, Dr. Fassinger, for your awesome presentation today.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.